Luke Archer had never imagined that the sound of chickens clucking in the morning could bring him peace. Yet here he was, standing on the porch of his small farmhouse, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise roll gently over his 4-acre property. After years of city noise, cramped apartments, and meaningless deadlines, the quiet hum of rural life felt like redemption. The air smelled of wet grass and cedar. The wind carried nothing but the scent of soil and pine. When Luke had bought this old parcel of land 2 years ago, everyone had warned him it would be too much work for one man, but he didn't mind. The effort itself was healing. Every nail he drove, every seed he planted, every small repair to the weathered fence made him feel like he was rebuilding not just a home, but a life. The chicken coop, a solid structure made of repurposed oak, was his proudest project. It had taken him 6 weeks to build, working late into the nights under a single floodlight, guided more by instinct than by plans. Inside were 8 hens and 1 stubborn rooster named Copper, all of them hand-fed and well cared for. The neighbors sometimes teased him about his mini-farm, but even they admitted his property looked beautiful. Neat rows of vegetables, a restored barn painted a deep red, and a gravel path winding toward the front gate. There was no sign of chaos here, no noise, no conflict. Just peace. That morning, Luke lingered longer than usual outside, tracing his gaze over the fence line. He had checked and rechecked it countless times since moving in, ensuring every inch of his boundary was clearly marked. His parcel was outside the HOA that governed the newer subdivision across the road. He had been careful about that detail when purchasing the property. He'd read the covenants, compared maps, and even had his lawyer confirm it. He wanted no part in neighborhood politics or endless rules about grass length and mailbox colors. His land, his choices, that was the promise he had made to himself when he left the city behind. The decision had come after a slow collapse. The end of his marriage, the burnout from his architecture job, the gnawing sense that he was living a life designed by someone else. Here, finally, there were no expectations, no prying eyes, and no committees telling him what he could or couldn't build. Freedom had never felt so tangible. But freedom, as he was about to learn, could be fragile. Around noon, while stacking lumber near the barn, he noticed a white envelope tucked under the latch of his gate. It was heavy paper, official-looking, with a gold-embossed header that read, Oak Ridge Meadows Homeowners Association. He frowned, immediately uneasy. His address wasn't even in Oak Ridge Meadows. It was 1 parcel over, beyond the last streetlight where the HOA's jurisdiction ended. Still, curiosity got the better of him. He tore it open and scanned the neatly printed letter. Dear Mr. Archer, it began, you are hereby notified of a violation of Section 4B of the Oak Ridge Meadows Community Standards regarding the unauthorized housing of livestock within the residential perimeter. A fine of $250 per day will be assessed until compliance is achieved. The words blurred for a moment as his brain tried to process them. Unauthorized livestock? Daily fines? It didn't make sense. His property wasn't under their control. He wasn't even a member. His first reaction was disbelief, then anger. He read the letter again, slower this time, noting the tone, arrogant, bureaucratic, as if guilt was already assumed. At the bottom, the signature, Trish Barkley, President. He recognized the name vaguely. She lived across the road in the big house with the perfect hedges and matching mailbox. He had seen her once or twice, always dressed like she was attending a board meeting rather than walking her dog. The kind of woman who spoke in policies and violations instead of sentences. Luke crushed the letter in his fist, then smoothed it out again, forcing himself to breathe. There had to be a mistake, some clerical error, some mix-up in the zoning maps. He would clear it up tomorrow. Still, as he stood by the gate, the envelope fluttering slightly in his hand. He couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play, something deliberate. Across the road, behind the neatly painted fences and uniform lawns, a curtain moved slightly. Someone was watching him. The wind shifted, carrying a faint metallic scent, sharp and unfamiliar. For the first time since moving here, Luke felt the quiet wasn't peace at all. It was the silence before a storm. Luke didn't sleep much that night. The letter from the HOA lay unfolded on his kitchen table, its neat lines of text staring back at him like an accusation. He must have read it 10 times, each pass-through feeding his disbelief. There had to be some mistake, he kept telling himself. Maybe the HOA had outdated maps. Maybe his address had been entered incorrectly in their system. Or maybe it was just a clerical error from some overworked office assistant who didn't care enough to double-check boundaries. Still, the thought gnawed at him. The tone of the letter wasn't one of inquiry. It was a declaration of authority, like they already owned the ground he stood on. When the sun rose, Luke decided he wasn't going to waste another day wondering. He gathered the papers from his property purchase, survey maps, title documents, tax assessments, and drove to the Oak Ridge Meadows HOA office, a low beige building that sat beside the subdivision's manicured park. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and printer ink. A receptionist greeted him with the bored politeness of someone who had long since stopped caring about the people she served. "I'm here about a notice I received," Luke said, placing the letter on the counter. "There's been a mistake. My property isn't under your jurisdiction." The receptionist barely glanced at the paper before replying. "If you've received a violation, you'll need to speak with the compliance board. Mrs. Barkley handles those matters. She's in her office." She pointed toward a frosted glass door with gold letters that spelled President, Oak Ridge Meadows, HOA. Luke thanked her stiffly and knocked once before entering. Trish Barkley sat behind a polished mahogany desk, her posture perfect, her smile thin and rehearsed. Everything about her office was meticulous: neat stacks of files, framed photographs of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, even a bowl of mints placed precisely in the center of the desk. "Mr. Archer," she said before he could speak, her tone pleasant but distant. "I was expecting you." Luke frowned. "Expecting me? Then you already know there's been a mistake." Trish gestured for him to sit, folding her hands together like a judge preparing to deliver a ruling. "There's no mistake," she said evenly. "The Oak Ridge Meadows Homeowners Association recently expanded its boundary to include the parcels adjacent to our development. Your property falls within that new boundary." "That's impossible," Luke replied, his voice sharper than he intended. "I checked before I bought the land. My deed lists no association, no covenants, nothing. My lawyer verified it." "Boundaries evolve, Mr. Archer," she said, her tone condescendingly calm. "Our members voted last year to annex the outlying properties. The motion passed by a substantial margin. I assure you, the process was entirely legal." Luke stared at her, stunned by how casually she said it. "Annexed, without my consent. You can't just decide that my property is yours to control." Trish leaned forward slightly, her eyes cool and unflinching. "You benefit from our community, Mr. Archer. The roads you use are maintained by us. The security patrol that drives past at night, paid for by us. We simply expect all residents within the boundary to comply with our standards. It's about maintaining harmony." Her voice dripped with the kind of authority that came from never being challenged. Luke felt heat rising in his chest. "Harmony?" he said. "You're charging me $250 a day for a chicken coop. That's extortion, not harmony." Trish's smile didn't falter. "It's a violation, Mr. Archer. If you choose not to comply, the fines will continue to accumulate, and we will be forced to take further action. I'd advise you to remove the structure voluntarily before matters escalate." For a moment, Luke could only stare at her. It wasn't just arrogance. It was the certainty that she would win, that no matter what he said, the machine behind her would keep moving. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You have no authority over my land," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'm not part of your HOA, and I never will be." Trish's expression hardened, just slightly, enough for him to see the steel beneath the civility. "We'll see," she said softly. "Enjoy your day, Mr. Archer." He left before he said something he'd regret. Outside, the air felt heavy and electric. His hands shook as he started his truck, fury bubbling beneath his skin. He had dealt with bureaucrats before, but something about Trish Barkley unsettled him. Her precision, her confidence, the way she spoke as if everything had already been decided. That evening, Luke spread his documents across the dining table again, checking every line. His property deed, his title, the official survey, all of it clearly listed his land as part of the unincorporated county zone, not Oak Ridge Meadows. He even pulled up the county's public records online, confirming the boundaries. There was no overlap, no ambiguity. Trish had lied. But why? As night fell, Luke walked the perimeter of his land, flashlight cutting through the shadows. Everything looked normal. The quiet road, the rustle of wind through trees, the faint glow of porch lights from the houses across the way. Still, he couldn't shake the sense that he was being watched. The next morning, he woke to find another envelope taped to his gate. No stamp, no postmark. The same gold header, the same logo. Inside was a final warning notice stating that continued non-compliance would result in legal proceedings and that additional penalties had been applied, bringing his outstanding balance to $250. His jaw clenched as he read it. They weren't just pushing, they were daring him to fight back. He drove straight to the county assessor's office and waited nearly an hour before being called to the counter. The clerk, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, listened patiently as Luke explained everything. After a few minutes of typing, the man frowned. "That's strange," he said. "Your parcel isn't listed under Oak Ridge Meadows. It's classified as independent agricultural. Always has been." "Can I get that in writing?" Luke asked. The clerk printed a copy of the property record, stamped and signed, and handed it over. "This should clear up any confusion." Luke thanked him, feeling a brief surge of relief. Armed with the document, he drove back to the HOA office, ready to end the madness. But when he arrived, the front door was locked, the blinds drawn. A new notice was taped to the glass. "Office closed for administrative review." Below it, in smaller letters, someone had handwritten, "All legal inquiries must be submitted in writing." He stood there for several seconds, the sun beating down on his shoulders, a knot tightening in his chest. They were dodging him. As he turned to leave, he noticed a black SUV parked across the street. Inside, two figures sat silently, watching him. When their eyes met, the driver started the engine and pulled away. Luke stood frozen, the stamped document trembling slightly in his hand. Something was very wrong here. What had started as a simple property dispute was becoming something else, a calculated effort to intimidate him, to wear him down until he gave in. The fine wasn't about the chickens, and it wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control. He looked back at the locked HOA office, its reflection shimmering in the glass, and realized the quiet countryside he had once thought of as refuge had just become a battlefield. By the end of the week, Luke realized the situation was no longer a bureaucratic mistake, but an organized campaign. The fines kept arriving, now through certified mail. Each letter carried a colder tone than the last, detailing his continued non-compliance and warning that failure to resolve outstanding balances could result in a lien against his property. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if it weren't so menacing. Every envelope was like a threat disguised as paperwork, written in language designed to crush resistance through exhaustion. The figure at the bottom of the most recent notice made his stomach twist. $250 owed. That number wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the intent was. They wanted him scared. They wanted him tired enough to pay just to make it stop. The worst part was that they were careful. The HOA's letters were all perfectly formatted, quoting bylaws, statutes, and obscure procedural codes that sounded legitimate. To anyone else, it looked like Luke was the one breaking the rules. He called Trish Barkley again, though he doubted she'd answer. To his surprise, she picked up after 2 rings. Her voice was smooth, too calm, like someone amused by his persistence. "Mr. Archer, I've told you before, your property is now part of Oak Ridge Meadows. These fines are valid and enforceable." He forced himself to keep his tone steady. "I have the county assessor's report. It says otherwise. My land is zoned as independent agricultural. You have no authority here." Trish sighed softly, the sound grating and insincere. "You seem to misunderstand how governance works. Jurisdictional records take time to update. Our annexation vote passed, and once the county clerk processes the paperwork, your parcel will reflect the change. Until then, you are subject to provisional compliance." "Provisional," Luke repeated. "That's not even a real term." "It's in the interim policy," she replied curtly. "If you continue to resist, Mr. Archer, you're only making this harder on yourself." Then the line went dead. The arrogance in her voice lingered long after the call ended. He could feel something tightening around him, an invisible noose. That evening, he sat in his truck at the edge of his driveway, staring at the houses across the road. The Oak Ridge Meadows community glowed with a uniform perfection that felt unnatural. The same driveways, the same mailboxes, the same manicured hedges trimmed to regulation height. It was as if every home had been designed not for comfort, but for control. As his eyes traced the street, he noticed lights flickering on in several houses. Curtains shifted, silhouettes moved. For the first time, Luke felt like prey in plain sight. 2 days later, the harassment escalated. He woke to find bright orange tags stapled to his fence posts, official-looking HOA property violation signs, warning of potential seizure if non-compliance continued. He ripped them down, his hands trembling with anger. On the ground near his gate lay a small pile of cracked eggs, their contents oozing into the dirt. The symbolism was crude, almost childish, but effective. Someone had been on his land during the night. Someone wanted him to know he was being watched. That same afternoon, a county inspector's truck pulled into his driveway. The man stepped out, clipboard in hand, wearing a reflective vest. "Routine inspection," he said casually, though his eyes avoided Luke's. "We received a report about livestock waste runoff and possible health hazards." Luke almost laughed. "From who?" "Anonymous complaint," the man replied, scribbling something without looking up. The inspection was brief, perfunctory. It was clear the inspector didn't expect to find anything. He was just there to check a box. When he left, Luke caught sight of the same black SUV idling by the roadside again, tinted windows reflecting the light like a dark mirror. That night, the quiet of the countryside felt poisoned. Even the usual sounds, the crickets, the faint rustle of leaves, seemed muted, cautious. Luke couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant hum of tires on asphalt made his nerves tighten. Around midnight, he walked out to the coop with a flashlight to check on the hens. They were restless, fluttering in agitation, their feathers ruffled. The door to the coop was slightly ajar, though he was certain he had latched it earlier. He crouched to inspect the ground and saw a faint boot print near the gate, too large to be his. His throat went dry. Someone had been inside the fence again. He secured the door and stood in the dark for a long time, scanning the field, the tree line, the faint glow of distant porch lights. Nothing moved, yet he could feel the eyes on him. In the morning, he found the rooster dead. Copper lay still beside the water tray, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, just the quiet, obscene finality of it. Luke sank to his knees beside the bird, grief and fury mixing in his chest until he could barely breathe. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted to scare him, they wanted to break him. He buried Copper under the cedar tree behind the coop, marking the spot with a flat stone. As he pressed the dirt down, he felt something shift inside him. The fear that had gnawed at him all week hardened into anger. They had crossed a line. He called his lawyer, Gina Vega, and explained everything. She listened in silence, then said in a measured tone, "They're bluffing, Luke. They don't have jurisdiction over your land, but they're counting on you not knowing that. Keep every letter, every notice. We'll file a cease and desist and a complaint with the county zoning board." "That won't stop them," Luke said quietly. "They've already been on my property. They killed one of my chickens." Gina paused. "Then it's not just legal, it's criminal. Start documenting everything. Photos, dates, times. I'll contact the sheriff's office." That afternoon, he installed new locks on his gates and set up an old security camera he'd used during construction. He aimed it toward the road, letting its red indicator light blink conspicuously in the dark. Part of him hoped it would deter them. Another part hoped it would catch them in the act. But the next day, when he reviewed the footage, he found the camera feed cut off at exactly 2:13 a.m., replaced by static. When he went outside, the camera was gone. The mount was still there, the screws stripped clean. By now, Luke was sleeping in short bursts, waking every hour to walk the property with his flashlight and his rifle slung across his shoulder. It wasn't just about the chickens anymore. It was about his right to exist on his own land without someone watching, judging, or threatening him. Yet the more he fought back, the more invisible hands seemed to tighten their grip. The HOA wasn't sending men in suits to argue anymore. They were sending shadows, whispers, and fear. And behind all of it, Luke could feel Trish Barkley's cold smile, her belief that she was untouchable, that he would eventually bow like everyone else had. But she had misjudged him. He wasn't some compliant suburban homeowner who feared authority. He had built this place with his own hands, and he would burn it to the ground before letting anyone take it from him. As the sun set that evening, casting long crimson streaks across the horizon, Luke sat on his porch with his rifle resting beside him, watching the road in silence, waiting for the next move. The following week began with rain that seemed to settle over the land like a curse. The fields were slick with mud, the coop smelled of wet straw, and Luke's nerves were raw from sleepless nights. The rain drummed against the tin roof of his porch in an endless rhythm that mirrored the pressure building inside him. He sat with a mug of cold coffee, staring at the stack of envelopes piling up on the kitchen counter. Each one bore the same letterhead, Oak Ridge Meadows Homeowners Association, and each one carried another threat disguised as a notice of action. The fines had now reached nearly $10,000. The latest letter claimed that if payment was not received within 7 days, the association would pursue foreclosure proceedings pursuant to HOA bylaws. Luke laughed out loud when he read that line, the sound sharp and humorless. They couldn't foreclose on property they didn't own jurisdiction over, but that didn't matter. The HOA wasn't playing by law, they were playing by intimidation, and they were winning. He could feel himself starting to unravel under the constant pressure. It was Gina, his lawyer, who steadied him. She had started digging deeper into the records and found something strange. "Luke," she said over the phone. "I've gone through the county's archives. There's no record of any annexation being approved by the Board of Supervisors. Oak Ridge Meadows never filed the necessary petition to expand. What they did was pass an internal motion, which has no legal standing." Luke's pulse quickened. "So they lied to me. It's all fake." "Fake," she confirmed. "Completely fabricated. But here's the problem. They've been acting as if it's real for over a year, which means they've probably fined or threatened others too. This might not just be about you." That night, Luke sat at his desk long after dark, going through everything again. He spread out the letters, the maps, the property records, the stamped documents from the county assessor. On one of the HOA maps, printed in glossy color and labeled Updated Boundary 2024. He noticed something subtle but unmistakable. The boundary line had been redrawn by hand, the new border cutting directly through his property in a perfect curve. The ink was faintly smudged, as if traced from another document. The forgery was crude, but it had fooled enough people to pass as official. He stared at the map for a long time, the weight of realization pressing on his chest. This wasn't incompetence. This was corruption. Someone inside the HOA had deliberately altered the documents to extend their reach, and Luke's land had been one of their first targets. When he told Gina the next morning, she immediately scheduled a meeting with the county clerk. Together, they presented the forged map alongside the official survey. The clerk, a tall man with thinning hair and an expression of weary disapproval, examined both carefully. "This," he said finally, tapping the HOA version with his pen, "isn't one of ours. Whoever filed this didn't go through the county office. There's no record of it being approved or even submitted. I'd recommend you keep your documentation safe. You might be dealing with fraud." Luke felt a grim satisfaction at hearing the word spoken aloud. Fraud. Not a misunderstanding, not a dispute, a crime. But the clerk's next words chilled him. "Be careful, Mr. Archer. People don't forge maps like this unless there's something valuable involved." That night, Luke returned home to find tire tracks cutting deep into the mud near his gate. The chain he had locked that morning was gone, replaced with a new one, thicker, newer, and locked from the outside. A laminated tag hung from it. "Property under HOA review, entry restricted." His hands clenched as he tore it free. He didn't even have to guess who was behind it. Trish Barkley was making her move. He forced the lock open with a crowbar and drove his truck up the driveway, mud splattering against the fenders. Inside the house, his phone buzzed with a new message. "Tampering with HOA property is a criminal offense. Consider this your final warning." No signature, just a text from an unknown number. He didn't call the police. Not yet. He'd learned enough to know that small-town law enforcement rarely stood up to the HOA. Instead, he decided to fight on his own terms. The next morning, he met Gina at her office, where she introduced him to a private investigator named Ethan Cole, a former county surveyor who had spent years uncovering zoning fraud. Ethan was in his 40s, broad-shouldered, with the cautious manner of someone who'd seen too much bureaucracy to trust anyone easily. He listened carefully as Luke described everything, then nodded slowly. "If what you're saying is true, they've created a shadow jurisdiction. Fake documents, fake boundaries, and real money at stake. These cases always start small, but they don't stay that way. Someone's profiting off this." "You think they're targeting landowners?" Luke asked. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "They target anyone who won't comply. Fines build up, liens get filed, properties go up for auction, and somehow the same investors always end up buying them cheap. It's a cycle. And if your parcel sits near undeveloped land, you're sitting on something valuable." The implications hit Luke like a blow. His property bordered a stretch of wooded acreage slated for a new development project. If Oak Ridge Meadows gained control of his land, they could connect that project to their community and triple its market value. He had become an obstacle in someone's plan, a name on a list to be pressured until he sold or broke. That night, while Ethan combed through public records and Gina prepared legal filings, Luke couldn't stop replaying every encounter with Trish Barkley in his mind. Her confidence, her smirk, the way she had dismissed him as if she already owned him. It wasn't just arrogance, it was certainty. She believed the system would protect her, because people like her had built the system to serve them. Around midnight, the rain returned, heavier this time. Luke was sitting by the window when headlights appeared at the end of his driveway. A vehicle idled there for several minutes, its beams cutting through the downpour. He turned off his lamp and watched from the shadows. Eventually, the car backed up and disappeared down the road. But the message was clear. They wanted him to know they were still watching. He sat there for a long time, heart pounding until the rain drowned out everything but his thoughts. The next morning, Ethan called. "I found something," he said. "You were right to suspect Barkley. She's been approving these annexation documents through a shell committee. 3 members, all of them connected to a real estate investment group called Meadowline Holdings. The same company that's been buying up foreclosed lots around the subdivision for pennies on the dollar. Guess who's on their board?" Luke's grip tightened around the phone. "Trish Barkley." "And her husband," Ethan confirmed. "It's a classic scheme. Manufacture violations, drown the owner in debt, seize the property when they can't pay, and flip it through the investment firm. They've probably done it 6 times already." Luke felt the anger return, sharper than ever but steadier now, tempered by clarity. They had picked the wrong man this time. "Can we prove it?" he asked. "We can," Ethan said, "but it'll take evidence, emails, transactions, witnesses, people inside the HOA who've seen what's going on." "Then we start there," Luke said. "We'll find someone." 2 days later, a chance encounter gave them their opening. At the county office, while filing a copy of the fraud complaint, Luke was approached by an elderly woman with silver hair and trembling hands. She introduced herself as Marlene Curtis, a former HOA secretary. "I heard about your case," she whispered. "You're not the first one. They tried the same thing with the Davises last year, claimed their tool shed was an unauthorized structure, fined them into debt, then took their house at auction. I quit after that. Couldn't stomach it anymore." Luke's pulse raced as she reached into her purse and pulled out a small flash drive. "I kept some of the records," she said. "Emails, meeting notes, financial ledgers. You'll want to see them before they disappear for good." When Luke opened the files that evening, what he saw confirmed everything. Internal memos between Trish Barkley and Meadowline Holdings executives detailed plans to streamline the integration of peripheral parcels and accelerate enforcement to encourage compliance or turnover. They had even listed projected profits from each targeted property. His name was there, underlined in red. Parcel 49A, high resistance, estimated acquisition timeline, 6 months. Luke stared at the line until the words blurred. They had been planning to destroy him from the beginning. The fines, the harassment, the threats. It was all a calculated process. For the first time since this nightmare began, he didn't feel powerless. He felt something else entirely, a grim, focused resolve. They wanted him to fold, to disappear quietly into paperwork and fear. Instead, he would expose them. He would drag every lie into the light, no matter how deep he had to dig. Outside, the storm raged harder, lightning cracking over the hills and thunder rolling like distant artillery. Luke stood at the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, his reflection fractured by each drop. He no longer saw himself as a man defending a few chickens. He was defending something larger, the right to stand on his own land without being devoured by greed disguised as order. he whispered to himself, a vow carried only by the storm. They started this war. Now they'll see how it ends. The days that followed blurred into a tense rhythm of defiance and retaliation. The evidence Marlene had given him was explosive, but Luke knew that exposing it would take time, and time was the one thing the HOA was determined to deny him. Each morning brought new signs of their pressure campaign, letters, anonymous phone calls, and the slow tightening of bureaucratic nooses. The fines, now exceeding $15,000, were being reported to a collection agency that didn't exist when he searched its name. His mailbox had been pried open twice, and once he found the carcass of a dead crow inside, its black feathers slick with rain. The message wasn't subtle. He was being hunted not just through paperwork, but through fear, and whoever was orchestrating it wanted to break him before he reached the courthouse steps. Gina was relentless, filing injunctions and formal complaints with the county, but every response came back delayed or muddled. "It's like someone's leaning on the system," she said grimly during one of their late-night calls. "Documents are being misplaced, hearings postponed, and your case keeps getting reassigned. It's not coincidence." Luke wasn't surprised. Trish Barkley and her network had deep roots in the community. She'd sat on local committees, donated to county elections, and cultivated an image of respectability that shielded her from scrutiny. But the mask was slipping. People had started whispering. 2 other homeowners reached out to Luke through an anonymous email address Ethan had set up, both claiming similar experiences. Unlawful fines, mysterious liens, threats that appeared out of nowhere until they sold their properties at a loss. The more Luke read, the clearer it became that he wasn't fighting one corrupt president. He was up against an entire system of quiet extortion masquerading as neighborhood order. The harassment turned physical on a Thursday night. He came home from town to find his front gate wrenched open, the padlock missing again. The chicken coop door hung by one hinge, and the hens were scattered across the yard, feathers drifting in the cold wind. One of the birds was gone entirely, another badly injured. He knelt beside the trembling creature, his hands shaking as he wrapped it in a towel. Under the harsh beam of the porch light, he saw the crude letters carved into the wooden coop wall. "Comply." The sight made something inside him snap. He no longer cared about playing by their rules or waiting for bureaucratic justice. This was war, and he intended to fight back. The next morning, Ethan met him at the property. He examined the carved letters, the broken gate, and the damaged coop with the calm, detached precision of a man cataloging a crime scene. "They're escalating," he said quietly. "You need to be ready for them to push harder. Once they realize you won't fold, they'll try to discredit you." "They already are," Luke said bitterly. "Yesterday, a deputy came by asking if I was keeping livestock without proper sanitation. Someone filed a complaint saying I was dumping waste into the creek." Ethan's brow furrowed. "They're setting a record. A paper trail that paints you as unstable, irresponsible. When this hits court, they'll use it to undermine your credibility." "Then we'll make our own trail," Luke replied. "Every letter, every visit, every threat. They're all going on record. If they want a war on paper, they'll get one." By that evening, Luke had set up motion sensors and cameras around the perimeter, each one feeding to a hard drive locked in a safe. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sliver of control returning, fragile but real. Yet that night, as he sat on his porch with the hum of cicadas filling the dark, a shadow flickered across the tree line. The motion light flared, catching the brief shape of a figure retreating into the woods. Luke grabbed his flashlight and ran toward the trees, mud splashing beneath his boots. By the time he reached the fence, the figure was gone, leaving only a faint impression of footprints and a folded piece of paper weighted under a stone. He picked it up with trembling hands. Inside, written in tidy block letters, were the words, "Stop fighting. This is bigger than you." He didn't sleep at all after that. When dawn came, he drove straight to Gina's office with the note and the latest batch of footage from his cameras. Together they reviewed the video frame by frame until, at 2:46 a.m., a dark SUV appeared at the edge of the property. The license plate was obscured, but a second camera caught a clear view of the driver's face for just 1 second before the glare of headlights erased it. It was unmistakable. Trish Barkley. "That's your smoking gun," Gina said quietly, her voice tight with both triumph and dread. "She can't explain that away. We'll take this to the sheriff and the state attorney. No local court will touch her after this." But when they filed the evidence, the response was chillingly muted. The sheriff's deputy accepted the footage without comment, promised to look into it, and sent them on their way. 2 days later, the footage was mysteriously corrupted in the official record, listed as unreadable. The realization hit Luke like a cold wave. The system wasn't just compromised, it was complicit. The same hands pulling the strings in the HOA reached into law enforcement, the courts, maybe even the assessor's office. He understood now why people gave up. You couldn't fight something that wore the mask of legitimacy. But giving up wasn't an option. That evening, he sat in the half-light of his living room, Marlene's flash drive plugged into his laptop. He went through the files again, searching for anything they'd missed. Then he saw it, a document labeled Internal Memo 6B, dated just 3 weeks before his first notice. It outlined a target acquisition schedule and mentioned coordination with the County Development Committee to streamline rezoning for investor-ready properties. At the bottom of the document, in bold font, was a note. "Ensure Archer's compliance before November. Investor bid pending." That was the motive. They weren't just after his land. They were timing it around an investor deal. If they could strip him of ownership or force foreclosure before November, the development company could buy his property at a fraction of its value. Everything, the harassment, the intimidation, the sabotage, was a part of a timeline. He called Ethan immediately. "I found it," he said. "The connection between Barkley's HOA and the County Development Board. They're laundering property through these investor deals." Ethan's voice was grim. "Then you need to move fast. If they think you'll go public, they'll try to silence you." That warning proved prophetic. 2 nights later, Luke woke to the sound of breaking glass. The back window had been shattered, shards glinting across the floor. He grabbed his rifle and swept through the house, heart pounding. No one was inside, but the power had been cut, and the cameras were offline. He went outside, scanning the yard under the moonlight. The coop door was open again, swinging gently in the wind. On the inside wall, someone had left a new message, carved deep into the wood with the same crude knife strokes as before. This time it read, "Last warning." Luke stood there in the cold night air, the words burning into his mind. The threat was no longer subtle. They were telling him to choose, his land or his safety. But they had underestimated what that land meant to him. It wasn't just dirt and wood and fences. It was proof that he could still stand for something when everything else in his life had fallen apart. He took a deep breath, gripping the rifle tighter. If they wanted a final warning, they would get one in return. He was done waiting for permission to defend what was his. The morning of the court hearing arrived heavy with gray clouds that seemed to press down on the earth, thick and unyielding. Luke barely slept. He spent most of the night at his desk, going through every file, every photo, every time-stamped video clip one last time. The evidence filled 2 thick folders, one documenting the forged annexation maps, the other showing the harassment, the vandalism, and the message carved into his coop. He could still feel the echo of those words in his mind, the violence behind them, and he wondered how people like Trish Barkley could sleep knowing the damage they caused. When Gina picked him up at dawn, she said nothing for the first few miles. They both knew what this day meant. It wasn't just a hearing about fines anymore. It was a reckoning. The courthouse sat at the edge of the town square, a squat, pale building with faded marble steps and an air of indifference. Inside, the walls smelled faintly of mildew and old paper. The hearing room was small, paneled in wood, with a handful of locals sitting in the back rows, pretending not to watch. At the front table sat Trish Barkley, immaculate as ever in her tailored suit, a calm smile plastered across her face. Beside her was the HOA attorney, a man with sharp eyes and a voice that carried arrogance like perfume. They looked like they had already won. Luke took his seat across from them, his hands steady despite the pounding of his heart. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The sound of the gavel hitting wood was sharper than he expected, like the crack of a rifle in the distance. The proceedings began, predictably, with the HOA attorney reciting a list of alleged violations. His tone was rehearsed, dripping with feigned civility. He spoke of community standards, residential harmony, and collective responsibility. He described Luke's chicken coop as an unauthorized agricultural structure and accused him of consistent non-compliance. At one point, he even referred to Luke as a disruptive element in an otherwise peaceful community. Luke listened in silence, each lie sliding across the polished surface of the courtroom like oil on water. When the attorney finished, Trish turned her gaze toward him, cold, victorious, like a queen watching a peasant await judgment. Then it was Gina's turn. She rose slowly, the faint scrape of her chair against the floor cutting through the silence. Her voice, calm but firm, carried the weight of every document, every sleepless night, every line of proof they had gathered. "Your Honor," she began, "what this association has done is not enforcement. It's exploitation. They have extended their authority beyond their legal boundary, falsified maps to seize private property, and used intimidation to silence opposition." She handed the judge the folder containing the official county map and the forged version side by side. "The county clerk has verified that this document," she pointed to the one with the new boundary, "was never filed, approved, or recognized by any government authority. It is a forgery created by the Oak Ridge Meadows Homeowners Association to justify illegal fines." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge adjusted his glasses and examined the papers in silence. Gina continued, her tone sharpening as she laid out the sequence of events: the escalating fines, the vandalism, the surveillance footage, and the pattern of harassment. When she presented the memo from Meadowline Holdings linking the HOA to land speculation, Trish's composure finally cracked. Her jaw tightened, her fingers twisting together in her lap. The attorney objected, his voice rising with false indignation, but the judge waved him off. "Sit down, counselor," he said curtly. "I want to hear this." Luke's moment came when Gina called him to the stand. He didn't want to speak. He wasn't good at speeches, but he owed it to himself to say the truth aloud. He told the court about the letters, the dead rooster, the messages carved into his property, the sleepless nights listening for footsteps outside his window. He spoke about moving to the country for peace, about believing in hard work and fairness, and about watching those things erode under the weight of greed disguised as governance. His voice wavered only once, when he described finding the word "comply" carved into the wood of his coop. The courtroom was silent except for the steady hum of the fluorescent lights. When he finished, he looked directly at Trish. For the first time, she looked away. The judge deliberated in silence for several minutes, flipping through the pages, then finally removed his glasses and spoke. "The evidence presented shows clear misconduct by the Oak Ridge Meadows Homeowners Association," he said. "The court finds that the property in question lies outside the association's jurisdiction, and all fines and liens are hereby declared void. Furthermore, this court will refer the matter to the district attorney for investigation into possible fraud and abuse of authority. The gavel struck the desk once, a sharp final sound that reverberated through the room. Trish stood abruptly, her face pale beneath her makeup. "Your Honor, this is an overreach," she began, but the judge cut her off. "You've had your say, Mrs. Barkley. I suggest you use what time you have left to prepare for the consequences." The words landed like a blow. When it was over, Luke didn't celebrate. He simply stepped outside, the humid air of the early afternoon filling his lungs, and let the sound of the world wash over him. The traffic, the distant hum of conversation, the whisper of wind through trees. For the first time in months, the air felt clean. Gina joined him on the steps, her face drawn but relieved. "You did it," she said softly. He shook his head. "We did what we had to. It's not over yet." She nodded, understanding. There would be investigations, lawsuits, and retaliation. But the tide had turned. The lie was exposed. That evening, back on his property, Luke stood by the coop as the sun set behind the hills. The hens moved quietly inside, settling for the night, unaware of the war that had raged over their existence. He looked at the fresh wooden door he'd built to replace the broken one, the soil still dark from rain, and felt a strange calm settle over him. The fight had cost him more than he had expected. Peace, sleep, trust. But it had given him something too. Clarity. He understood now that standing your ground wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to surrender to fear. As the last light faded and the first stars appeared, Luke whispered to the darkness, almost as if to the land itself, "No more." In the weeks that followed the court's decision, the neighborhood shifted like a living thing waking from a long sleep. The headline spread quickly through the town. HOA fraud investigation underway. For years, residents had whispered about unfair fines, strange assessments, and the quiet disappearances of homeowners who couldn't pay, but Luke's case had dragged those whispers into daylight. Trish Barkley resigned within days of the ruling, though the statement she released to the press claimed she was stepping down for personal reasons. Her husband vanished from the board of Meadowline Holdings soon after, and the once flawless image of Oak Ridge Meadows began to crumble. County officials launched a formal audit of the HOA's finances, uncovering a web of shell accounts and undisclosed property transfers that went back nearly a decade. The names attached to those deals were familiar: politicians, developers, and even a sheriff's deputy. What had seemed untouchable now lay exposed, a monument to greed built on ordinary people's fear. Luke kept his distance from the spectacle. Reporters had shown up at his gate. Neighbors had come to apologize, and strangers had written letters thanking him for standing up, but he wanted no part in the noise. His battle had never been about fame or revenge. It had been about reclaiming the simple right to live without interference. The coop stood repaired and quiet now, the hens returning to their calm rhythm. On cool mornings he still rose before dawn, coffee steaming in his hands, watching the mist lift from the fields. Sometimes he caught himself expecting to see another envelope on the gate, another sign, another threat. It took time for his body to forget what vigilance had done to it. The silence that had once frightened him now felt sacred again, a silence he had earned. Gina visited one afternoon, bringing with her the final set of documents from the county confirming that his land was permanently excluded from any future annexation attempts. She smiled as she handed them over. "You're officially untouchable now," she said. Luke laughed softly, though the sound carried more relief than joy. "I never wanted to be untouchable," he said. "Just left alone." They stood together for a while, watching the chickens scratch at the dirt, the late sunlight turning the air gold. When she left, he lingered outside until the horizon burned orange, listening to the faint sounds of life returning to normal around him. Months later, a new HOA board was formed under the supervision of county oversight, and the community began trying to rebuild what had been poisoned by corruption. Some residents approached Luke, inviting him to attend meetings, to help create fairer policies, to become part of something new. At first, he refused, but eventually, he agreed to attend one. Standing in that bright community hall surrounded by people who had once avoided his gaze, he realized something unexpected. Victory wasn't about isolation, but reclamation. He wasn't just defending land anymore. He was redefining what it meant to belong. When he returned home that night, the stars were bright and the road was empty. The gate creaked softly as he closed it behind him, and he felt a quiet certainty settle deep within. The fight was over, but its lesson would never fade. Freedom, he thought, wasn't a gift. It was a choice made again and again, even when no one was watching.